How's it going, everybody? Professor Tatum here to lead you through yet another lecture for History 1301. Here we go, here we go, here we go. Back in time to the British 13 colonies along the eastern seaboard of North America. And here we're looking at colonists struggling to hold tight to their habit of self-rule, which they've developed throughout the colonial period, which they now saw was being threatened by new policies that Britain was implementing after the 7 Years' War. We'll start out with a little bit of context as usual. Then we'll look at some of the new British policies that were being implemented after the 7 Years' War. And then we'll look at how colonists responded to those. And we'll wrap up by looking at the First Continental Congress. A few things we need to remember as we jump into this lecture. This habit of self-rule that colonists were developing were based largely on their colonial assemblies that they had. And the power that these colonial assemblies held was really a matter of perspective. So remember, from the colonist perspective, their colonial assemblies had equal standing to all levels of British government. They were just as important as anyone else. Whereas the British government saw in their eyes that the monarchy and parliament clearly ran the show. And even the colonial governors who they appointed over the colonial assemblies had far more influence than the colonial assemblies themselves. The colonial assemblies were something they just kind of let the colonists have to keep them happy and keep them occupied. But this idea of self-rule that colonists were getting from their colonial assemblies was certainly being reinforced by that British policy of salutary neglect. Remember, salutary neglect essentially refers to turning a blind eye to minor violations of crimes, or definitely to people refusing to pay certain taxes. And remember, the major reasons that Britain had been implementing this policy of salutary neglect was because through most of the colonial period, France was there nearby, and they were a growing presence, and they were competitors colonially with Britain. They were having imperial wars as well. And on one hand, they were just more caught up in other issues. A lot of times they were busy fighting France or dealing with other issues back in England or in other parts of the world. So they didn't really care enough to be sitting here focusing on all these colonists refusing to pay their taxes, because they had bigger fish to fry. Furthermore, there was a lot of disputes over certain territory between British colonists and French colonists, and the British Empire wanted to make sure that they kept the colonists on their side as much as possible. They wanted to appease them as much as possible so that they didn't consider perhaps jumping ship and siding with the French to get whatever it was that they wanted. This idea of self-rule was also further reinforced by the ideas promoted by John Locke, this concept of liberalism that John Locke emphasized. Remember, we saw that by the 7 Years' War, there were books circulating throughout the colonies, including John Locke's book, The Two Treatises of Government, where he talked about that social contract and talked about things like natural rights that all people have. And a big basis of what John Locke was arguing in his writings was that government's authority is based on the consent of the governed. And so the colonists began to think, okay, if we've got these government assemblies, these colonial assemblies, we're governing for ourselves, we kind of get to decide which policies we choose to follow, which ones we don't. We get to decide which taxes we pay, which ones we don't. That's simply an example there of us giving our consent for what laws we will and will not follow, and the British government doesn't crack down because their authority is based on our consent. The 7 Years' War, though, would kind of shake up the habit of self-rule that colonists had fallen into, and definitely in turn would build tensions between the colonists and the British government. From the colonists' point of view, okay, the war was over. They're basically thinking, hey, thanks for coming and helping out, Mom and Dad. Thanks for bringing all these soldiers and all this support. But, the war's over now. Y'all can go home. France is gone. We don't need your help defending ourselves from them anymore. Head on home. And the way the British saw it is, okay, well, now we've got all this new territory we need to administer. Also, there's all these Indians in this region that you guys keep causing trouble with, and they're fighting back, and they're getting pretty upset, so we're going to leave some troops around to kind of help defend from them. And so there's definitely a conflict of what the British stance should be in North America at the end of this war. Furthermore, with France out of North America under the Treaty of Paris 1763, which had ended this war, the British now had all these new land claims, right? They had all this new land that was under their domain, on paper at least. Of course, all that's mostly populated by indigenous peoples. But a lot of these colonists here on the eastern seaboard, where the colonies were hoping to come expand out into this new territory, use it for things like farming or settling, especially this Ohio River Valley, which had been disputed with France. Remember, there was that very lucrative hunting grounds in there that could really be useful for the fur trade. And after the war, the colonists were really looking forward to having access to all this new land. But then remember, after Pontiac's War, there had been a lot of destruction to the British colonies, and the King of England wanted to kind of ease those hostilities. So he created that proclamation line. The proclamation line of 1763 basically ran along the Appalachian Mountains here and told British colonists that they could only expand up into this line here, and that all territory west of that was safe ground for indigenous peoples. Now, the colonists saw this as an absolute overstep of the British government's authority. All right, they're saying we are not used to having the king come in and tell us where we can and cannot settle. Again, this perhaps fed into their what they believed as a threat to their habit of self-rule they'd fallen into. They're used to being able to say, hey, we want to expand out into this land over here. Let's just put together an expedition, go kill the people already living there, kick them out of their homes, and we'll go settle in that area. Now the king's saying, okay, you can do that as much as you want, but only up to this line here. And they see this as a threat to what they're used to, okay? Again, it's a habit that they've fallen into, of this idea that they have a sense of self-rule. So another thing that really fed into these tensions that were growing between the colonists and the British government after the 7 Years' War, though, was after the 7 Years' War, the British government stopped practicing salutary neglect. And they started kind of cracking down a little more on making people especially pay their taxes that they had not been paying before. A few reasons for this. One major reason is France is no longer here in North America. So they no longer had to worry about keeping the colonists happy, keeping them willing to defend the colonies from the French, or keeping them from defecting to the French. Furthermore, now they're no longer occupied in war with France and other parts of the world as well, so they can focus their efforts more here. But a major reason that they ended this policy of salutary neglect was that they needed to raise revenue. They had just fought this very expensive war, the 7 Years' War, against Spain and France, and they had accrued tremendous war debts throughout that war that they now needed to pay off. And the way they're going to choose to try to pay off those war debts is by collecting revenue from around their empire. So they're really going to start cracking down now on people paying their taxes and making sure they're paying up. Again, that's perceived as a threat to this habit that colonists have fallen into, choosing which taxes they're going to pay when. Okay, these tensions here would all be further amplified as well when the British government would start passing new tax policies to try to raise even further revenue, largely to help pay off those war debts from the 7 Years' War. All right, one great example we can look at of this is the Stamp Act. All right, so the Stamp Act was a tax that taxed all paper goods, everything from newspapers to books to even playing cards, all right? And this worked very similar to how our postage stamps work, okay? You had to have a stamp showing that you had paid this tax on any paper good. And colonists had some real issues for this tax for reasons that we'll see moving forward here. But real quick, I want to show you kind of how the mind of a historian works. As I was putting this lecture together a couple of years ago, my mind started wondering. I started to think, well, would toilet paper be counted here? Is that, it's a paper product? And so I ended up emailing my mentor in the middle of the night, asking him what he knows about toilet paper in relation to the Stamp Act. And he basically emailed me back saying, John, go to sleep. But no, toilet paper was not common in North America, or really even most of Europe for that matter, until the mid-1800s or so. And he sent me this article here that has all kinds of interesting information about the history of toilets and toilet paper and outhouses and all that jazz. Here's a chamber pot, all used here in North America. People were using things like leaves and even corn cobs to wipe their I just cannot even imagine. I don't want to even think about too hard what the logistics of using a corn cob for that would be. Just the thought of it. Anyway, there's also this interesting poem down here about an outhouse you guys might be interested in. So enjoy that. Then from here, as I started getting lost in this train of thought, I also started letting my thoughts drift back to the traumatic memories of what was going on with toilet paper during COVID. But just as I did then, I will now help us regather our thoughts and get back on track to the Stamp Act. That's exactly how, at least my mind works when I'm studying history. I start looking at a topic and then I start having so many questions about that topic, and I can get lost down all these little rabbit holes. But then you just got to bring your way back in. And I personally find that to be part of the beauty of the learning process and even the research process. But anyway, I digress here. I'm going to get back on track. So, the Stamp Act. Taxing all paper goods in the colonies. Toilet paper not included because they didn't have it yet. People had issues with this, as I suggested, and they began to protest this new tax at the colonial assembly level. So members of these various colonial assemblies started sending secret correspondence to one another. Okay, the real official committees of correspondence would start a little later, but they started essentially forming committees of correspondence, meaning having these kind of secretive networks of communication where they were spreading messages back and forth to each other about their discontent with these new British policies, and in particular against the Stamp Act in this case. And they decided to convene, and they had a meeting known as the Stamp Act Congress, in which delegates from various colonial assemblies came together and kind of talked about how they were going to respond to this in their respective colonies. And they all kind of agreed that their issue was not with paying taxes, okay? They had no fundamental problem with being taxed. Their problem was that they were being taxed without representation, okay? So they didn't have a representative in Parliament who was governing on their behalf, and they felt as if this decision had been made for them without their consent, right? Tying very heavily back into the ideas that were taken off throughout the colonies in this period that government's authority should be based on the consent of the governed, right? And so the basic statement that they made to sum up their grievances was no taxation without representation. That's where that saying comes from. Please note that at this point in time, they're not saying anything about independence, okay? They're not interested in breaking away from the British government. They simply want the British government to start representing them a little more accurately, perhaps, and to perhaps repeal this policy here. Their issue, we could maybe suggest, is that they're basically arguing that the British government, in their eyes, is not being British enough because it's not doing what they feel that the British government is meant to do by not representing them properly in Parliament. But the British government offered a rebuttal to this. They said, no, you guys have a virtual representation. Whenever Parliament convenes and we make decisions, we have somebody who considers you guys as he makes decisions. He kind of makes them on your behalf. So he kind of speaks up for y'all. Problem with this is, England's on an island nation all the way on the other side of the world, representing all these colonies here along the eastern seaboard of North America. And we've seen that even within all these different colonies, they have various regions, and each region has their own kind of motivations. And even within some of those regions, there's a lot of distinctions between the individual colonies, so they can't even agree on what they want to do half the time. So is it really accurate to have an individual all the way on the other side of the world in the island, the nation of England, representing all of these colonies all the way over here in North America? It doesn't really seem like that's going to be very accurate representation. And that's the argument that was made by these colonists here, okay, against the British government's excuse of no, you're receiving virtual representation. But these protests went far beyond the colonial assembly level. There were people certainly taking to the streets. There were a lot of grassroots movements leading protests and even riots throughout the North American colonies. So these here all mark major cities in which there were major protests or riots. There were several smaller scale incidents of protests throughout the colonies not marked on this map here. But simply by what we see here, we can see that this was pretty widely spread, okay? That this wasn't a small-scale matter. These protests and riots were largely led by organizations like the Sons of Liberty and the Daughters of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty were more involved with kind of the direct action of getting people onto the street, making demonstrations, leading marches, things like that. Whereas the Daughters of Liberty, they participated in some of all of that as well, but they primarily took on the economic side of things, leading boycotts and creating goods here. Look a little more at that in a second here. Some of these protesters, though, I want us to understand, took some very radical actions throughout their time of protest. Some more radical than others. But we can see that they were going into the streets and doing things like burning their stamps, kind of in a similar fashion to how Vietnam draftees later down the road in American history would burn their draft cards. Okay, it's kind of burning the symbol of what you're standing against. Others would take it a bit further and they would make effigies of tax collectors, meaning basically models of tax collectors, some kind of dummy or scarecrow or pinata type figure to resemble a tax collector. And then they would humiliate that tax collector. Maybe they'd hold a mock funeral or they'd hang it from a post and throw things at it. Maybe hang it by the neck, cut its head off, beat it. And this would send a message to the tax collector that, hey, this is what we think of you, and if you keep pushing these taxes on us, this could be you. Some people took things even a step further, right? At some of these liberty riots, people would go and do things like destroy tax collectors' homes and destroy tax offices and publicly humiliate and commit violence against tax collectors. And I want us to understand that this is nothing new. These kinds of protests and riots that involve things like property destruction and some violence have been happening since before the United States was the United States. Now, I'm not by any means sitting here saying that I condone violence or that I condone all the actions taken by all these protesters. I'm simply saying this is a part of our history and it's nothing new. This has been happening for generations. I hear people say things like, oh, these people these days, they have no respect and they go out destroying property and looting and rioting. That's not the American way. We didn't used to do things like that. And that I think ties back into what I call present centricism. We like to think that we're living in the most important time and that kind of makes us feel special in a way. And it makes it easier for people of one generation to simply blame, oh, well, this isn't something that's for my generation. This is the up and coming generation. It's all their fault that everything's going wrong. When that's a load of malarkey because we'd have to go way, way, way far back in human history to really be able to trace where this all started. Okay, this is nothing new. So if anybody talks crap about your generation, saying that y'all are the rabble rousers causing all this trouble, point them back to the Sons of Liberty. All right. But these tactics here, Britain had seen similar tactics throughout their empire. Okay, even in England, in certain situations, people would protest in this manner against certain things, including some of these new tax policies after the 7 Years' War. So these only had so much influence on the British government. What really swayed the British government to decide to eventually repeal the Stamp Act were the economic protests made by primarily women, okay, from organizations like the Daughters of Liberty. They encouraged people not only to stop buying British manufactured goods, but they started creating their own goods here in the colonies that could be used in place of those British goods. They also helped people find ways to smuggle in certain goods from other places in place of British goods. And this really kind of stood counteractive to the whole purpose of the Stamp Act. Okay, remember what Britain was doing with this new Stamp Act is they were trying to make money to pay off their war debts. But if people in response to the Stamp Act are starting to cost them money by refusing to buy all these British products, and that's really taking money from them, it defeated the whole purpose, right, of having the Stamp Act. I'm not saying the other protests had no impact. They certainly did. But this really seems to be the strongest driving factor led to Britain deciding to eventually repeal the Stamp Act. Okay, so they did repeal the Stamp Act. As soon as they repealed the Stamp Act, Parliament also issued a statement known as the Declaratory Act, in which they essentially just declared that they had authority over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Basically reminded them who's in charge. This is basically just a reassertion of Parliament's power dynamics, reminding the colonists, you work for us, okay? We are in this mercantilist system. The whole reason you exist is to serve our empire. We are in charge. And a little later down the line, though, Britain tried again. They passed a series of acts known as the Townshend Revenue Acts. The Townshend Revenue Acts tax imports and exports on luxury goods, meaning goods that aren't necessarily needed for survival, but they certainly make things a lot easier or nicer. Products like lead, paper, paint, glass, and tea. Tea, especially, a lot of people had issues with. We need to understand that was really the staple drink in the American colonies. People would be drinking it throughout the day. And to help reinforce these tax policies here, the King of England kind of backed Parliament up. And maybe we could look at what he did here in a sense as his unofficial declaratory act. So he sent 4,000 troops to the colonies to help suppress the rebellion and to help enforce the Townshend Revenue Acts. And he also ordered for the Massachusetts Colonial Assembly to be shut down. Reason he picked Massachusetts is because that was kind of the central hub of this protest movement that had been growing against changing British policies. But this is essentially him here demonstrating again to the colonists, we allow you to have these colonial assemblies. And if you start acting up, we can take them away. Right? And we will send force over as necessary to ensure that you comply with our authority. The colonists really had problems with this. And a lot of it ties back to their history. Remember, I had suggested that one reason a lot of colonists began coming to the colonies over time was for political reasons tied to the English Civil War. Remember, during the English Civil War, there had been this one absolute monarch. Then there was the bloody Civil War between the monarchy and Parliament's army. And then Oliver Cromwell, who was the military leader of Parliament's army, came to power and established a military dictatorship. And so these people here in the colonies have heard stories about what life was like in England under Oliver Cromwell's military dictatorship and how fierce the military was. And now they have all these soldiers coming in and marching through their streets to enforce laws that they disagree with fundamentally. This is going to really intensify the resentment that existed between the colonists and the British government. Okay. I mean, this would lead pretty directly into the Boston Massacre. All right, Boston Massacre is a great story, and like most great stories, it starts out at a bar. So there were a lot of colonists hanging out at a bar one night, having some drinks, and they started talking politics. And anybody who's been talking politics with friends while having some drinks knows that things can get heated up pretty quickly. And a lot of these colonists are just sitting there talking about how resentful they are of these recent changes and how they really don't like having all these troops in their streets and they disagree with the new policies they have to follow. And they decided, some of them, that it would be in their best interest, while they were all drunk and fired up, to go take some kind of action against all this. Guys, I can tell you, as much as it might seem like it in the moment, that is never a good time to go take any kind of action like this, all right? But they went into the streets, and they went and found some British soldiers who were out on patrol. And they kind of gathered together and started heckling these soldiers. And the soldiers started saying, guys, y'all need to go home, you're drunk. And they're shouting insults back and forth at each other. And some people on the street saw what was going on, and they came and joined with these other colonists and formed a mob. And they're hurling insults back and forth. The British soldiers are really saying, guys, y'all need to go home. This is getting out of hand. And instead of going home, thought it'd be a great idea to throw some snowballs at the soldiers. And then some people decided that wasn't enough and started throwing rocks and sticks and harmful objects that were really hurting the soldiers somewhat. Now, I certainly understand that at that point in time, nobody should have to just sit there and endure having rocks and sticks thrown at them. And these soldiers decided that they were going to take some kind of action in response. We need to consider that these are soldiers of the most professional army in the world at this point in time, arguably. They should be very well trained, and they're here in the colonies to help suppress a rebellion. So this is the exact kind of thing that they were here for. So you might figure that they have some kind of plan in place to de-escalate things and maybe detain some of the rabble-rousers and throw them into local jail or something like that. Instead, they fired into the crowd, and they wound up killing 5 people. All right, 3 of them died pretty quickly. 2 of them died later either from their wounds or from infections from their wounds. Among the dead was an African-American man named Crispus Attucks. He was an African-American sailor. And that just clearly demonstrates to us the long history that African Americans have had in fighting for American liberty, okay? So here in this protest movement, which would later be the basis of the American Revolution, maybe that's jumping ahead a little bit, using a little Whig history there, but we can certainly see that what's happening here will be kind of the basis of arguments for the revolutionary thought moving forward. And already as a part of this, there's an African-American man going down in the name of liberty, okay? Very clearly demonstrating the long history of African-Americans in fighting for American liberty. But later down the road, when these soldiers were taken to trial and asked why they did this, one of them suggested that perhaps he had heard the word fire. And he assumed that it must have been a command from his commanding officer. So he went ahead and fired into the crowd. And then the other soldiers kind of went along and said, we heard his gun go off and then we started shooting. But the problem was there were all kinds of testimonies, both from soldiers and individuals who were present there, who either said nothing about this word fire or contradicted and said, no, that did not happen. We need to understand their commanding officer was very quick to say, I did not order them to fire. Do not hold this against me. All right. It is possible, I guess, that, maybe somebody was yelling something about something being on fire. Or it is possible that one of these colonists was trying to be a badass and saying, fire, go ahead, shoot me, so what? And then regretted it the second he took a bullet to his side or whatever. I don't know, though. To me, I don't see much evidence to support the basis of this word fire being yelled. This leads to a big debate among historians here, a couple of the big debates that I want you guys to get in on considering the evidence you've seen here. So I want us to think about two things. Number one, were the British soldiers justified in firing on the crowd? Number two, was the Boston Massacre really a massacre? Okay, so some people will suggest there were only 5 people killed. A massacre really refers to a mass slaying of individuals at some kind of disadvantage, but there's only 5 people killed here, only 3 immediately. Is that really a massacre? So I'll have you guys go ahead and pause in a second and work on an in-class activity where you can respond to your interpretation on these two things here. Remember to avoid those personal pronouns. You don't need to tell me, I think, I believe, in my opinion, my interpretation. I know what you're writing. You don't need to say all that. I would like you to use college level writing, and just give me 1 to 3 sentences on each of these in your lecture activity, and just break down for me what your take is on each of these. Okay, were these soldiers justified? Say something along the lines of, these soldiers were justified in firing on the crowd because, or were not justified in firing on the crowd because. Or say something like, the Boston Massacre should be or should not be considered a massacre because. So go ahead, pause here, knock out that lecture activity, and jump back on. All right, guys, good work. You are now part of the scholarly conversation here. There is a fair argument I would suggest to be made on either side here. Personally, I lean more toward these soldiers not being justified in their actions, okay? Again, these are professional trained soldiers here for this kind of thing. I'd like to think that there was something else they could have done to handle this in a non-lethal manner. That's not to say that the colonists were necessarily justified in throwing sticks and rocks at the soldiers. I'm not saying that there was no reason for the soldiers to take any kind of action. I'm simply saying using lethal force against unarmed civilians doesn't really seem justified. And that's my way of interpreting what I see here based on the evidence provided. Okay. On this other question, I absolutely consider this to be a massacre. Okay. I think if we're counting on whether it's 5 people, whether it's 10 people, whatever, that's just kind of splitting hairs. Human lives are human lives, guys. There's multiple being taken, unarmed civilians being killed by trained armed soldiers. I absolutely consider that a massacre. Okay. If there were 5 members of our class who were killed by police or National Guard or anything like that, I would absolutely consider that to be a massacre. There are 5 people in my direct family between me, my parents, and my sisters. If we were all killed in a disadvantaged situation like this, I would certainly hope that people cared enough to consider that a massacre. But again, these are just my interpretations based on how I understand and explain the evidence. You guys may do it a little differently. That's fine. That is the study of history in a nutshell. All right, moving forward. This Boston Massacre, though, also definitely demonstrates to us the importance of perspective in history. All right, we need to understand that this has been portrayed in very different ways. Not long after the massacre itself, Paul Revere, who was a diehard member of this patriot movement, meaning the protest movement against these new British policies, made an engraving that depicted the Boston Massacre. And this painting here is based on Paul Revere's engraving of the massacre. We need to consider Paul Revere has some kind of incentive or some kind of agenda, we could say, to portray this massacre in a certain way. Right? He could use it as a selling point to really get support for this protest movement that he's a part of. And we certainly see that depicted here. Okay, the way he depicts it are these poor helpless colonists just being mowed down by these British soldiers. And these are just people out hanging out, walking their dogs, minding their own business, being helplessly gunned down. Whereas over here, we see a painting made a little later down the road that I would suggest probably more accurately depicts more or less what was going on there. Okay, here we have some people maybe running for their lives back here, but you also have some colonists kind of egging on the soldiers. And we see some little makeshift weapons, things that they had, like the rocks and the sticks they were throwing. We see that at play here. We also see Crispus Attucks in this painting here. Don't see him depicted anywhere over there. So like, I kind of prefer this depiction here. It seems to more accurately reflect the evidence. That's not to say that both of these don't have a purpose that we can learn a lot from. Okay. Again, this just very clearly shows us history is not just telling the story and okay, here's the evidence, here's what happened, that's that. We've got to interpret it. We got to make sense of it. We got to consider perspective, right? All these things are a part of understanding and explaining the past. In the aftermath of this massacre, it was John Adams, who was a member of the Patriot protest movement, who defended these soldiers in court. Pretty fascinating. His argument was, look, guys, if we're going to say that we're all about liberty as preached by John Locke and we're all about natural rights, then it's only fair that all men are given the right to a fair trial. Okay. And I'm going to do everything I can to give these guys a fair trial in the same way that I would give any of my clients a fair trial. And John Adams, we can see here, was a pretty damn good lawyer. The final verdict of this case led to most of these soldiers being acquitted. 2 of them were charged with manslaughter, and their punishment that John Adams was able to help them get worked out for manslaughter, they didn't have to do any serious prison time or anything like that. All they had to do was get the letter M branded onto their thumb. So they basically got a free tattoo as their punishment for manslaughter. Manslaughter, by the way, I need to clarify. I probably should clarify this to my other classes as well. Is a much lesser charge than murder. Okay, manslaughter is kind of the indirect causing of somebody's death. I had a student the first time I taught this say, how the heck did they get charged with manslaughter? They literally fired guns at people. And I said, hey, that's a very clear sign there of a damn good lawyer. What I really want us to understand, though, okay, so we have a pretty good idea of what the Boston Massacre was, what happened with it. In terms of what it led to, this did lead to the repeal of the Townshend Acts. It kind of led to the British government to realize just how heavily these acts were resented. This also led to increased tensions between the British colonists and the British government. Now that the British soldiers had fired on some colonists, a lot of people are starting to get more upset with the whole kind of issue of disputes at play here. So one thing that was being taxed, though, under the Townshend Acts, of course, was tea. And that was left on the books somewhat. And reinforced through what was known as the Tea Act. So all those other good things like lead, paper, paint, those glass, those were no longer being taxed. Tea continued to be taxed, and under the Tea Act, people were required to buy tea from this company known as the British East India Company. So the goal of this Tea Act was twofold. Of course, on one hand, it's continuing to raise revenue for the British government, but it's also helping bail out the British East India Company. So the British East India Company had been in cahoots with the British government for some time. They'd helped each other do all kinds of shady favors around the world and helped each other profit in different ways. And the British East India Company had made some poor economic choices and were not doing so hot, and they needed a little help. And I think we still see in the 21st century that if a common person is struggling and needs help, oh, it's all their fault. They shouldn't have made those stupid choices. We shouldn't have to pay any taxes to help them. But if a big company has made some mistakes and they've screwed a lot of people and now they're failing, oh, we need to go bail them out, right? And that's, again, nothing new. Here, the British East India Company, because it was failing, the British government really wanted to help them out. So to do so, again, they put this monopoly over tea in the colonies and allowed only the British East India Company to sell tea in the colonies. That's basically telling the colonists, this is who you have to buy from. And overall, the way this all worked out, I'm not going to get too lost in the logistics here, but this ended up giving the colonists cheaper tea than they had been purchasing before. So it didn't really hurt them economically. But there was a strong matter of principle there that the colonists stood firmly against. Okay, again, this violated their consent, their liberty. They were being told who they can and cannot buy tea from. Now, they found ways to smuggle in tea and continue to do what they wanted, but there was still this fundamental problem that they had against being told what they can and cannot buy. You'll hear people sometimes make these irate arguments that, oh, well, the American Revolution was really all about some rich guys who didn't want to pay taxes. And it goes far beyond paying taxes, guys. Again, here, this is cheaper tea. The problem is not with the tea, and they're finding ways to get it in. They're smuggling it in, no problem. The problem is that they are seeing that they're being told to pay this tax without consent, and they're being told what they can and cannot buy. This is, in their eyes, a violation of their consent of the governed, a violation of their liberties, okay? And protesters, in response to the Tea Act, started adopting more violent and extreme methods of intimidation and protest. Okay. So, for example, this is where we saw a lot of tarring and feathering of tax collectors, things like hot tea being forced down people's throats. And it was also where we saw the Boston Tea Party. So, the Boston Tea Party was an episode of direct action taken by the Sons of Liberty. They disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians, and they boarded a ship that was docked at Boston Harbor that was full of tea from the British East India Company that was going to be sold here in the American colonies. They started whacking at the tea with some hatchets and then throwing it overboard so that all the tea would be ruined. Some accounts do suggest that some of this tea was given to some of the families in the nearby area to consume. But the vast majority of this tea was thrown overboard, okay? This is a serious blow to the British and to the East India Company economically. And remember, when we were looking at the Stamp Act, it was economic pressure that really put the most kind of pressure on the British government, right? And so here there's this extensive economic damage being directly dealt to them by the Sons of Liberty. But one thing historians are very unclear on is why they chose to dress up like Mohawk Indians. Now, I like to ask students this, and I've got some different answers whenever I ask this. Some will say, well, perhaps it's their way of showing that they are now Americans. They're dressing like Native Americans to show that they're seeing themselves now as separate from the British. But most of them were very hesitant at this point still to break away from the British, so I'm not so sure how well I go along with that one. Another argument some people make is they were trying to disguise themselves and hide their identities. Well, they're surrounded here by people watching what's going on. There were also, according to accounts, some British officials on ships nearby as well who could have seen who they were. So I'm not so sure that disguising themselves here is really much of a factor of play, maybe for some of them. But really, the point I'm getting at here is there does not seem to be a clear explanation for why they chose to dress up like Indians, and Mohawk Indians in particular. You know, all these explanations that students offer and other historians have offered are probably a lot more credible than the reason I think they did it, because I'm assuming they dressed up like Mohawk Indians just because they wanted to look cool. I mean, who wouldn't want to look like this, or this, or this, or this? By the way, any of you who are history majors or plan on taking upper level history classes at any point, this is going to be your best friend. We joked in my capstone class and in grad school, we called this the History Writer's Bible. Anyway, the British really kind of pushed against this Boston Tea Party, and they really criticized the Sons of Liberty and colonists who supported their actions here. And they said, you guys are hypocrites. You know what? You say that your issues are all based on these ideas of liberalism, yet one fundamental point of liberalism is that a natural right all people have is the right to property. And here you are destroying all this property. And you're violating the British East India Company's right to their property. And this brings about a very kind of big picture question. We got to consider here that the British East India Company is working hand in hand with a government and in a way to support a government that, from the colonist point of view, is violating the consent of the governed. And that kind of begs the question, is there protection for a company that's working hand in hand with a government that's not ruling by consent? Do they have the protection of that natural right of property, or does that kind of get overpowered by this right here that government must be ruling by the consent of the governed? There's a big argument that could be made on either side there. But what I really want us to understand most of all about this Boston Tea Party in terms of significance is the way the British responded. They were very upset about this. At this point, they weren't playing games anymore. This Boston Tea Party led the British government to pass a series of acts known as the Coercive Acts, referred to in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts, because they thought they were so intolerable. So I'm fine with you using either of these terms if you write about this on an exam or anything like that. Both of these terms are widely used to describe these acts here, the Coercive Acts and the Intolerable Acts. We just need to understand that these are the acts put into place essentially in response to the Boston Tea Party. And we need to understand that these are a real crackdown of British authority. This is the British really putting their foot down, showing we are in charge. And to the colonists, these are seen as an extreme threat to their habit of self-rule. So let's look at the major acts that were included within these intolerable acts. One was the Boston Port Act. Act. So the Boston Port Act called for a blockade to be placed around the port of Boston and basically shut down the port of Boston until the citizens of Boston were able to pay the British government back for the damage that they had caused during the Boston Tea Party. This really upset a lot of colonists and got a lot more people on board with the protest movement. Because before it hadn't really had a whole lot of impact on a lot of colonists. Maybe the Tea Act got some people up in arms because they were having to buy tea from a company that they maybe didn't want to. Again, though, they found ways to kind of smuggle tea in and get away with that. That's a lot more difficult as the British are here blocking off the support of Boston. Boston, we need to understand, is a major city where a lot of goods are coming into the colonies and being distributed out from. So this is really kind of limiting the types of goods that people have available to them now. And this is starting to impact people in terms of what they can and cannot have access to. So this is getting a lot more people on board with this protest movement. Another act that was also certainly seen as intolerable and getting a lot of people really infuriated was the Quartering Act. So this refers to quarters, as in living quarters. Under this act, colonists were required to provide housing or quarter for British soldiers, either by building them barracks, or if they were unable or unwilling to build them barracks, they could sometimes be forced to quarter soldiers in their homes. So they might have a soldier come knocking on their door one day, say, "Hey guys, me and my boys here need a place to stay for a few nights, and we need some hot food." And the people here would be required legally to give them shelter in their housing and provide them with whatever it was that they needed. Certainly, we can see why this would be viewed as intolerable to these colonists. I think most of us in the 21st century would see this as something pretty threatening. Luckily, we have, as a result of this, guarantees in our Constitution that this will never happen. But really considering, particularly here, the history of English people, remember, they have this resentment toward strong standing armies as a result of Oliver Cromwell's military dictatorship after the English Civil War. And now they have troops coming into their homes in some cases. Just the idea that this could happen to somebody has a lot more colonists kind of really getting resentful toward the British government and fearful of the direction that things might be going. Another one of these acts was the Administration of Justice Act. This act called for all British officials or military officers who were charged with any crimes in the colonies to be tried over in England. Okay, so their trial would be held in England. Their argument was that there's no way they could receive a fair trial in the colonies because the colonists were all so biased against the British soldiers that there's no way they'd receive a fair trial here. Pretty strange considering if we look back to the Boston Massacre, one of the members from the Patriot movement came to the defense of the soldiers and really helped them get off the hook. All they had to get is a couple of them had to get a little tattoo on their thumb. But this is the argument the British made. And under this act here, required all trials for British soldiers and officers to be held in England, where they would be tried by their official peers who would really likely be more likely to be biased in their favor. I think we can clearly see how some colonists might be upset by that as well. Another one of these acts was the Massachusetts Government Act. This act shut down all colonial assemblies throughout the colonies. Again, this is just a clear reminder by the British government, we are in charge. Okay, we're under this mercantilist system. You exist to serve us. We allowed you to have those colonial assemblies, and you abused that privilege. So now we are taking it away. I really don't understand the name though, because we got to remember the Massachusetts Assembly had already been shut down by this point. But they called it that. What we need to understand is it shut down all the colonial assemblies. And by the time these acts were being passed, again, the colonies saw these as intolerable. This went far beyond the Stamp Act or the Townshend Act or the Tea Act. They saw this as something they were really going to have to respond to in a much more significant way. Okay, so here's where they started really developing more organized committees of correspondence to start communicating with one another about how they're going to respond here. And again, various delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies in this case decided to convene and hold what they refer to as the First Continental Congress. Their goal here, pretty clearly, was to decide on how they would respond, in this case, to these coercive acts. And this Continental Congress very clearly demonstrated the extent of disunity that still existed among the colonists. So there were major factions. One group known as Patriots, These are the people who have been on board with these protests against the British government, who really heavily resented the British policies and favored things like liberalism and these Enlightenment ideas of liberty and natural rights. These are kind of the people that I think most of us probably think of when we think of the American Revolution. Okay, individuals like Benjamin Franklin and Paul Revere and Samuel Adams. And by this point, some of the very radical patriots were starting to gradually consider ideas of independence, meaning leaving the British Empire to form an independent nation. Not all of them were on board with that by this point, but some of them were starting to fall more into that direction. Those who did were considered to be very radical, all right? By contrast, there was a faction known as Loyalists or Tories. This includes people like Jonathan Sewall, who you guys have read a little bit from. You also he made some arguments against these protests, suggesting that the British government was actually a pretty mild government that provided all kinds of protections for the colonists and helped provide them economic benefits. He, like other loyalists, also suggested that some of these patriots misused words like liberty to try to mislead the masses and get them on board with their opposition to the British government. All right. And while some of these loyalists did oppose these new coercive acts, they did not stand for the more radical tactics and some of the more radical rhetoric being used by some of the patriots. So there's a good bit of division there. And they really argued back and forth and couldn't really come up with a clear solution for what they were going to do. We need to keep in mind also that while these people meeting here at the First Continental Congress are divided between patriots and loyalists, and as I suggested, by the time the coercive acts are in effect, more and more people in the American colonies are getting on board with this patriot movement, or perhaps starting to side with the loyalists. Most people in the colonies weren't really concerned one way or the other. Right? For a lot of people, this still hadn't impacted them directly to a point that they felt that they had to be taken aside. However, within this Continental Congress, they did decide that they would declare the intolerable or coercive acts null and void. They would collectively refuse to abide by them, but they couldn't decide on much more than that. So they agreed that they would meet again in about a year and figure out how to take things from there. Again, key point I want us to understand is this First Continental Congress very clearly demonstrated continued colonial disunity, even as resentment was growing between the colonists and the British government. So even though a lot of them are starting to feel some kind of way about what the British government is doing, they don't all agree on how they should respond to that necessarily. And still, overall, we do need to stress that while some of the radical patriots were starting to lean toward ideas of independence, the Continental Congress as a whole was certainly not pushing for anything in that direction. All right, and even a lot of the patriots weren't quite on that board, weren't quite on board with that yet. So independence is still not the issue they're going for here, but they're starting to feel some kind of way very clearly about the British government by this point, and knowing that they need to take some kind of drastic measure. They just can't decide on what at this point. All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up here. Let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, that is it for now. For now.